Troy, thank you so much for joining us on today's Bitcoin Park Live. It's amazing to have you.
Thanks for having me, Rob. I'm happy to be here.
So we're not here to talk about Stoic philosophy or your recent academic work, as fun as that would be. Having proudly crowned myself as one of the maybe 20 or 30 people in the Bitcoin space who have gone so far as to look at your CV and actually pick through some of the analytic philosophy that you put together, mostly out of admiration. A lot of the pre-reading that's required to be able to understand it at a level of depth is more so in the pre-PhD, PhD track. But today, we're talking about something really interesting, which is some work that you've been doing that I don't think has been celebrated enough. And it's this fundamental data on really the question, it seems to me, of who is a Bitcoiner?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Rob, we've got to talk philosophy sometime on podcasts. And we were just saying this before the show. You are one of the very few people who's ever read anything I've done in philosophy, outside of philosophy, but also you have a philosophy background yourself. And I don't know about you. I find that Bitcoiners always want to talk philosophy. And our conversations end up like there's a gravitational well in philosophical questions that just pulls Bitcoiner conversations there. And I don't have the answers to those questions, of course. And when I get pulled into that gravity well with Bitcoiners, I think they're very often disappointed because they expect me to have answers. I don't. I only have more questions and maybe some collected wisdom from the past usually. But I think those are great conversations, and I'm always open to having one of those with you, Rob, because you've read a lot of stuff that I like the Stoics and Nietzsche and whatever, Ecclesiastes. So I'm totally open to that. But yeah, today we don't have much time. I just want to talk about the data from our most recent study, which will be coming out in the next week or so. And I'd like to kind of preview it and actually ask you questions for what to make of it. I'm still processing what to make of the data myself.
So bring us in high level.
High level.
The question, as I'm framing it, right, who is a Bitcoiner? And you are one of the few people who have actually done deep dive work into figuring that out. So I guess if you could maybe take us to the initial question, which is why? Why would you want to find out what the data says about who a Bitcoiner is?
Yeah, well, our hope is really I should introduce this thing first of all. I started a nonprofit organization called the Nakamoto Project with Colin Brown, who's another Portlander like me and who has a background in running a shop doing marketing work for clients like Nike and Skull Candy headphones and doing influencer campaigns and stuff like that. The goal was really to use marketing style communications and tools to bring in the next tranche of Bitcoin adopters. We wanted to go from early adopter to early majority and cross the chasm of adoption. That's our ultimate goal. And I think about Bitcoin communications as kind of at the bottom level of the stack is academic research, hardcore academic research, which is hard. Not many people understand it. And we're working on it through things like the Bitcoin Research Institute that Bradley Rettler is running at University of Wyoming. The next layer of the stack I think of as policy condensation of what comes out of primary research. So what the Bitcoin Policy Institute is doing, and that's directed to influential people in our world, policymakers, large banks, the public at large, but still people who want to read like briefs, white papers and one-pagers, and that's still not everybody. People just like
kind of executive observer almost.
Yeah, most people don't want to spend even that much time learning about Bitcoin. Should they? Yes, but do they? No. The slogan that Colin gave me is like, how do you want to communicate something to someone who's like walking down an aisle in a grocery store? That's your brief for communication, not like somebody who's going to make an important decision and wants to read a couple pages, but just somebody who's like turned on the radio for 30 seconds is waiting for their show to come on. Like that's the, advertiser frame. Wow. It's the sort of top of funnel first touch. How do you encounter the idea of Bitcoin? So it was that question that really got us started. And we started doing research to help us answer the question of who do we need to communicate to and what messages resonate, how do we get hooks into people's minds? And to do that, a first step is to figure out who owns Bitcoin already, who thinks well of Bitcoin, who thinks poorly of Bitcoin, and what do they like? So Andy Perkins joined us. He's the chair of the marketing department at Washington State University. He designed a survey a little over a year ago. We gave this survey, we contracted with a company to gather data for this survey from 3,538 adults in the US, 18 plus. And that was the largest survey to date about Bitcoin, Bitcoin ownership. And it was a comprehensive survey given to a roughly representative sample. We paid the company, which is Qualtrics, to roughly match US Census numbers in terms of age, gender, race, income, education levels, and other major demographic markers. And if I can give you the very high level of what we've found last year, I think our top line was that the demographics weren't really important except for age and gender. Basically, the younger you were, the more you were into Bitcoin, the more likely to own Bitcoin and like it. And also, males were 2 to 3 times as likely as females to own Bitcoin. So basically, it's a young man's world. Bitcoin is a young man's world. And in some categories of 30 years old and male would be 45% would own Bitcoin, in an insane amount. And then over 50, almost no one owns it. Over 50 and female, it's basically zero. Nobody owns it. So on the demographic front, we found young men are into it. We checked political orientation, and this was kind of the shocker. Nobody believed us at the time. But what we found, we measured political orientation in 3 different ways, was basically no relation between your politics and whether you own Bitcoin.
Wow.
The country it doesn't seem like this, but the country is still mostly moderate. Like the political distribution left to right is kind of a bell curve. It's mostly moderate, and the tails are growing, the extreme liberal and extreme conservative, but it's still mostly moderate. And we found Bitcoin had the same exact shape. It was just statistically indistinguishable from non-Bitcoin owners in our sample. Yeah, people didn't believe that because Bitcoin is embedded in an ideology, grew out of an ideology, and is philosophically incompatible with certain approaches to politics, just financing the government through money printing and shutting down any competition to the money printer is obviously compatible with Bitcoin. So Bitcoiners just refuse to believe it. But I think it shows us that the makeup of Bitcoin owners and Bitcoin enthusiasts is very different. The people who are likely to go to conferences, the people who are likely to talk about it on Bitcoin Twitter are not representative of Bitcoin owners. And that's because we found 1 in 7 Americans own Bitcoin. So in that survey, which is a pretty good sized number. And that is not represented on Bitcoin Twitter, and that's not represented, Bitcoin conferences. It's very normie, essentially. So that was the main upshot of our study last year was Bitcoin ownership is very much normal. Looks like if you all you know about it, somebody is that they're a Bitcoiner. That they're more likely to be male and female, and they're more likely to be under 45 than over 45.
Wow.
But
yeah,
you don't really know much else about them. Anyway, that was last year's data. I don't know if you wanted to pause and interject anything here.
You hit on
Rob.
a few really interesting things that I'm curious if you're going to get into, which is that if you queried kind of top line stated political orientations and then demographic data. So who is somebody from a demographic perspective, and then who do they say they are from an ideological orientation? And what you're describing, I think, is, well, first off, it's valuable on its face, because every news story that we've seen of late that's come out basically saying, I went to such and such conference and it's the new right-wing darling of Bitcoiners or some nonsense like this. If you've been in the space a little bit, you kind of brush it off, but then the thought crosses your mind that this news article is also going to go out to tens of thousands of people who may have an aversion or an attraction to it based on their own stated political stance. How deep did you go kind of querying people's ideological frameworks? You talk about the differences. Were there interesting similarities that you picked up that can explain this idea of it becoming kind of Normieville, or was it the case that it's, we don't actually know what's happening right now?
We used something called Moral Foundations framework, which it's a set of attributes that identifies groups by how much they care about various things, like how much they care about fairness, how much they care about authority, how much they care about purity, religiosity, liberty of 2 different kinds, and economic liberty and political liberty. And anyway, of these 2 profiles, liberals and conservatives robustly differ. Conservatives care more about authority and purity, and liberals care more about care and more about equality. So there's a kind of divergence in the moral profiles of liberals and conservatives. And we asked this battery of questions, and I don't know, it's like 25 questions to kind of 30 questions to establish a moral foundation's profile. And Bitcoiners turned out to have a profile that looked like neither liberals nor conservatives. We called it, but very robust. And actually, just to jump ahead to this year's data showed exactly the same pattern in Bitcoin owners. We called it, just informally among ourselves, we're calling it moral maximalism. They seem to care across almost every dimension more than average. Like they just more intense people, I guess. Like they were matched conservatives on like authority and, religiosity. They matched liberals on care. And so basically they always went with the higher amount of concern across the board. Wow. On liberty, you would expect those two to be off the charts for Bitcoiners, but they weren't really. They were just kind of right in line with conservatives on economic and social liberty. That was really shocking. Libertarians, we also asked a question where you could self-identify as a libertarian or a conservative or a liberal. We had, I think, 5% of Bitcoin owners identified as a libertarian. That is significant. That's double the background rate of libertarians in the population, right? So if you're a libertarian, you are more likely to own Bitcoin than not being a libertarian. But if you're a Bitcoiner, you're not likely to be a libertarian. You're 95% likely not to be a libertarian by self-identification. Yeah, we did find a unique profile for Bitcoiners. We don't really know what to do with this yet. It is distinct from political orientation and ideology. We're trying to dig into it, actually, to figure out like what's behind these values, like what's behind the value of fairness, the value of authority or whatever, and dig into those to figure out what kind of actual Bitcoin messaging resonates with those deep values.
It's interesting that you're describing a type and not a trait. You're describing this kind of trait set. And that is something that I find really interesting from a number of perspectives. There's this idea of maybe does it mean that there is maybe like a Bitcoin silent majority?
Yeah, I kind of think there is. I didn't tell you really like final headline from the report, Please. Which is we asked 4 questions to measure how much people knew or took themselves to know about Bitcoin, then 4 questions on how much they trust it in various ways, how much they think it's useful. That's another 4 questions, and another 4 questions on whether they think it's moral. So these 4 factors, knowledge, trust, morality, usage, represent 16 questions in the survey. And all of those questions and their combination correlate strongly with Bitcoin ownership, super strongly, more strongly than anything else. Moral foundations, demographics. Basically, we found that if you know a lot about Bitcoin, you trust it, you think it's useful, you think it's good, then you own it. And vice versa. If you don't know about it, you don't trust it, you don't think it's useful, you don't think it's moral, you don't own it. And all of those traits correlate tightly with each other. Like if you don't know much about it, then you don't trust it. If you don't think it's moral, then you don't think it's useful. Like it's all one big ball of wax. And, it naturally suggests that the type of a Bitcoin owner, the real type, is just somebody who knows about it. Somebody who knows what it is. Like it's the old trope about have you put in the work to learn about it? If you have, then you probably own it. But it might also be that people who own it are motivated to put in the work to learn about it. And then they come to trust it. They come to think it's good and so on. Right.
Yeah.
The causation is an open question. We were careful about not claiming to have discovered which direction it runs in. We suspect it runs in both.
Did you hear stories about origins of these newly minted moral maximalist Bitcoiners? Because I've heard it from a number of different perspectives, and some people swear by this idea of invest then investigate, kind of the famous investor adage, which is buy some, get some skin in the game, and then you start to figure out what the hell it is that you own. And other folks come from the perspective of, I want to do my research and I want to hunt and I want to figure it out and I need a tool or I need a utility. I've argued also personally that there's only 2 reasons to get into Bitcoin, that you're either greedy or you have to. So the memes are basically number go up or freedom money. And what you're describing is interesting. Do you have any inclinations about origin story? Obviously, this would be in like the anecdotal side or the liner notes of such and such respondent said, quote. Do you have any inclinations about any shared experiences, or is it really simply the case that it just has to get in there somehow, and then once the seed is planted, all these other factors start to emerge?
Yeah, I don't know. We didn't set up with an open field that would answer your question, so I don't have data on your question. I wish I did. I mean, informally, I do think that having skin in the game makes a tremendous difference. And also not having skin in the game makes a tremendous difference because it creates salt, because you missed out on a possibility of making money and then people double down on that, right? This is an epistemology question. Like, there's no neutral place to stand to evaluate something like Bitcoin. If you own some, you're probably going to be biased towards defending your investment and certainly curious about digging deeper in it. If you don't own it, you will have been losing money the entire time you haven't owned it, and that will influence your analysis. Yeah.
When you kind of dig into the data, we always think in terms of there's certain archetypes that you run into if you're cruising Twitter, right? Which is not obviously representative of the layperson who's owning and holding Bitcoin. But you might have, as you're describing, the Peter Schiff type, right? Or there's always the journalist who they find a tweet from 2013 of them dunking on Bitcoin or saying they sold their Bitcoin, and then 10 years later they're running a hit piece about how Bitcoin will fail.
Always.
And then contrary-wise, you see that there are, the hardcore maximalist class that can be subdivided, 6 ways from Sunday. Do you see those types show up in the data in any recognizable form? Or have we kind of entered your mother's Bitcoin era?
Yeah, I think that, okay, overall sentiment distribution for Bitcoin, and this is really a good big picture thing. There's a group of haters. They don't own it, and their ranking on knowledge, trust, usage, morality is like, they strongly disagree with every positive statement about Bitcoin, and they strongly agree with every negative statement about Bitcoin. Those are the haters. And there are more haters than there are people who are into Bitcoin at the other extreme. There's a lot of haters out there, but both of them are dwarfed by the great middle that is neutral towards Bitcoin on all of these dimensions: knowledge, trust, usage, morality. They're just neutral. That's the vast majority. And what you realize is that, yeah, the haters, they talk on Twitter, they post, and also so do the advocates. And the whole Twitter discussion is a fight between these two wings of the bell curve distribution, which do not reflect the majority of people who just don't care enough and have a strong enough opinion to argue. And so, yeah, looking at that overall, it's like, it reshapes your mind. You realize, like, okay, we are yelling at each other from the fringes, and that's fun. I mean, it's gladiatorial. I enjoy it. It's especially been fun for Bitcoiners because we do a lot of dunking, because there's a lot of price predictions from the haters that are repeatedly wrong. So we get to collect a lot of trophies in those fights, and that's fun. But we're not talking to the vast majority of people when we talk to them. That's the vast majority of people don't have any strong opinion, don't know very much about it, don't care, don't really think it's good or bad. They're a little bit suspicious of it. The center of that bell curve is not in the middle. It's a little bit to the left, to the disagree side. So we are slightly negative. And to jump to this year's report, what we found, good and bad, first of all, between these two reports, Bitcoin's price more than doubled. We had an election where a pro-Bitcoin president won. Regulations, basically we went from headwinds to tailwinds. We had massive ETF adoption, the fastest ETF growth in history for Bitcoin ETFs, faster than gold ETF. We had the birth of Bitcoin treasury companies apart from MicroStrategy and the explosion of them. So basically what Trump promised in his speech in Nashville, that we would do so much winning that we would be begging the president to stop winning, that all happened between our two surveys. However, sentiment towards Bitcoin declined. Not a lot, but slightly. It especially declined among women and liberals. So we saw ownership rates basically flat, and it's hard for us to say because one of our measures of ownership was just like, do you own Bitcoin? That was the question. And this year we put a special rider directly in front of that question, which is like, bear in mind this survey is not about any other cryptocurrency other than Bitcoin. And we didn't have that rider. So that number came out to be about the same as last year, slightly lower, but not statistically significant. But we don't really know whether it grew and we just scared more people off with our our precursor or whether it stayed the same. We have another method of measuring ownership, which is do you own Bitcoin in one of the following ways? And then you select as many as apply. And one is on an exchange, one's in an ETF, one is through a spouse or partner. And one is in self-custody, for instance, a hardware wallet. And that one, when you add up, or, not at all, in none of these ways. And when you add that one up, we got 18.6% of people who own Bitcoin in some way or other. And that's higher than 1 in 7. That's between 1 in 6 and 1 in 5.
Wow.
We didn't ask that question last year, but people asked us like, hey, how do people own Bitcoin? Do they own it on a hardware wallet? Or are these people who just have like $2 of Ethereum on Coinbase and they're calling it Bitcoin? So this is this is Bitcoin potentially custodied, 18.6%, which comes out to be 48 million Americans that are 18 plus. Given that many people under 18 also own Bitcoin, the number is probably closer to 60 million. But 48 million adult Americans who own Bitcoin is remarkable. That is, it's not other cryptocurrencies, that's just Bitcoin. Clarified as such. Another amazing stat we had from there was 4.21% of all respondents claim to hold Bitcoin in self-custody, for instance, hardware wallet. And when you look at that, that's like 11 million people. So like 11 million people hold their own keys. This is something that Elizabeth Warren tried to portray as, shadowy supercoder stuff. Fringe, like who's going to do that? And all of those people would count as banks, essentially, according to some, people in government. And they should make reports, et cetera. Like, anyway, that activity, I think this is maybe the most important finding in the report, that 11 million people claim to do this super shadowy supercoder, private banker kind of thing, which is just not run a node, which is hold their own keys, sign their own transactions. So we actually weren't sure whether this could be true. I did like a confidence interval analysis, and I think 3.8 was like the bottom. 3.8% was like the bottom of that interval, and it was close. So
it's still huge.
It's still huge, even if we are off a little bit. And then I looked at the sales numbers for Trezor and Ledger. Ledger has sold, I think, 8 million wallets and Trezor like 2 million wallets total. That's worldwide, and that's over the course of those companies' histories. So I don't think that number is made up of more than half, hardware wallet sales. But I also looked at downloads of mobile apps that allow you to hold your own keys. Things like Trust Wallet has 200 million downloads worldwide. That's one wallet, has 200 million downloads. If you look at like all of these other wallets like that, like Coinbase Wallet, Robinhood Wallet, I think it's very plausible that 11 million Americans hold their own keys and sign their own transactions.
There's an interesting thing that you're able to do with this recurring set of studies, which is that you can query over time and see how opinions vary. I wonder if you were able to do something a little bit different, which is query by time in the game per individual, because there's these interesting questions in my head around, well, okay, of those assumed 11 million Americans who are self-custodying, first off, I assume that maybe it's 5 because the early people bought every hardware wallet they could get, and they're sitting with like a drawer full of Trezors and cold cards and ledgers and whatnot. But assuming we've got 11 million.
I think that 11 million shouldn't, what you just said shouldn't affect that 11 million. That would affect like, of the 10 million wallets that Trezor and Ledger have sold, how many people does that correspond to? And I agree. Yeah. That's probably very few people. But the 4.21%, 11 million, is coming from just, do you self-custody Bitcoin?
Set. Yeah.
That's. So
it's not based on the sales, it's based on the individual.
So just based on the individual saying, that's how I hold my Bitcoin in self-custody.
Were you able to do any kind of analysis into something like attitudes or opinions based on it's almost like you do this time series versus individual series style experience, like time slice versus like running it over a series of time. Because the thought that crosses my mind is, I wonder about those people who rank themselves maybe in the 80th percentile of moral maximalist type, or maybe they're in the 30th percentile, but they own something and they've been in Bitcoin for a year. I would be super curious to see how attitudes change per individual as you go from year to year, if the kinds of things that we tout so loudly, these ideas of, oh, you should get a bidax and learn how mining works. You should, custody your own coins. Well, you start with an exchange, and then you've got to get off an exchange. It makes me wonder if there is any data or any inclination, any guesses that you have around, can we create gradations of how much of a moral maximalist you are, and would that correspond potentially to how long you've been in the game? Because it's, as you and I know, like this thing takes a while to figure out. And over time, yeah, we might have an exponential growth curve in terms of adoption, but in terms of the learning that comes with that adoption, we should expect to make the same dumb mistakes over and over again until we get deep into the late majority, because the number of people coming in at any given point in time is going to be equal to or larger than the people that have been in since the beginning of Bitcoin.
Yep. That would be great to figure out. One thing we were careful actually with the survey company to guarantee that none of our subjects, we got 3,538 people each year. None of them were repeats, right? So we didn't get the same people again. We got new people, all new people. We did ask people, like, have you owned Bitcoin in the past?
Boy.
And no longer owned it. So we're looking at who sold their Bitcoin, and we asked why they sold it. And most people sold it just because they needed money. But I like what you're saying. Yeah, I think the trajectory of a Bitcoiner, what we learn on our journey, is very hard to teach. A lot of people just kind of go through the same, a lot of people go through the same path. But it also might depend on when you came in.
That's right.
Maybe the people who came in this last year came in through the ETF. That's a new channel to come into Bitcoin. Doesn't mirror the past because it's not some janky exchange. And it's also, there's less, they're not interested in taking their Bitcoin off the exchange because there's no in-kind redemption even.
That's right.
They don't feel the same about risk, but they also don't have that same value of self-custody. I looked into the self-custody set because I was like, okay, there's a hardcore set. Well, the 11 million. We can all agree that whatever, if you have your own keys and you hold Bitcoin, come on, you're a Bitcoiner in some hardcore sense. And I looked at their politics, and it was barely different from the overall group. That was really shocking. I expected to find self-custodied Bitcoiners to be more libertarian leaning.
The anarcho-capitalists and the cypherpunks and the... So
what we did find politically, however, this year was we start seeing it drifting to the right. So if the political neutrality we found last year among Bitcoiners was broken. Not much, but you can see a noticeable uptick in the right wing and a downtick in the left wing, especially a downtick in the left wing in ownership. And in sentiment, the sentiment of like knowledge, trust, usage, morality, Bitcoin sentiment drops among the left wing, and it doesn't really drop on the right. It just kind of stays steady. So that's, I think, the impact of what has happened. And this is, just to step back, and I'm curious to get your feedback on it. But we had all this winning at the institutional level and the political level and the price between our two samples. We had ownership. We can't really tell whether it grew or not. Sentiment declined, overall sentiment towards Bitcoin. Among Bitcoiners, sentiment went up. Among owners, it went up from the previous. It's like polarizing along gender lines, along political lines, and along ownership lines. Non-owners, sentiment went down. So in some ways, we saw attitudes get entrenched and more negative among the people you would expect to dislike Bitcoin. And that's the toll, I guess, on the sentiment side that the politicization took. Donald Trump is a stronger brand than Bitcoin. Something like 90% of people know of the brand of Bitcoin, but it's a strong brand. It's an incredible worldwide brand. But I think the Trump brand is even stronger.
Yeah.
And very negative for some people. And I think we saw the result of that. So it's a combination for Bitcoin of wins and losses. The 18.6% people own Bitcoin in some way or other is amazing. Between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 people, 48 million American adults own Bitcoin, 11 million self-custody Bitcoin. Those are awesome top-line results of the survey. It's starting to politicize, and the attitudes towards Bitcoin trending negative, especially among women, liberals, and non-owners. That tells us that it's not been a clean victory, right?
Yeah. I think it's, I'm not surprised by it, but I don't think I have a sense that this is an existential or long-term threat towards the success of the protocol and the Bitcoin experiment, right? Because there is this, what makes me think about it is In the context of Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin mining, we were just getting hammered.
Destroyed.
Hammered and hammered and hammered for years. The academics were not behind us. The environmentalists were not behind us. The politicians didn't know what to do with us. They had no schema for what miners were doing or wanted to do, or the pros or the cons or anything like this. It seemed like the Wild West cowboys of the shadowy supercoders, basically the cowboys who never learned how to code, figured out how to plug in machines, right? And what was interesting from my perspective watching this particular saga unfold was that, and I don't even know when it was happening. It was happening very publicly on X with the kind of pros versus cons fighting each other. I had noticed something, and I think I actually maybe mentioned this to you a couple of years ago, where a lot of these very well-respected, highly regarded environmental types were being very directly challenged by the cyber hornets, and they would say things, and once they had been done being called silly names and being attacked as one does on the internet, they were running into a brick wall, where it had become apparent to me that there was so much popular thought and zeitgeist behind being an environmentalist. It was seen as sort of a safe thing to do, and it was seen as almost beyond reproach, that when they started coming out with opinions against Bitcoin mining and facing some very, very, very smart people who had very good reasons for doing and believing what they did, for the first time I saw this whole group of people tripping over themselves, because they were trying to fight against Bitcoin, but I think many of them, and Daniel Batten's been the largest advocate of that amongst yourself and many others in the space and the environmental side of things, they were tripping over themselves because they wanted to hate it so badly, but at a fundamental level, it solved their problem. And I wonder if that's the same thing that we are experiencing with the political zeitgeist, which is people are getting into Bitcoin assuredly because the Trump brand is so strong and because he's so pro-Bitcoin, and he showed up to the conference and J.D. Vance showed up to the conference, and it's become this great torch for the Republicans to carry. But seeing that happen, and then seeing on the other side, I see a lot of the progressive Bitcoiners now getting very, very, very vocal about their cause. It makes me wonder if we're going to see the exact same thing happen, which is the rest of the political apparatus realizes that this thing that they feel like they should, as a gut reaction, be diametrically opposed to because of, in the case of mining, energy usage, or in the case of politics, it's aligned with the wrong camp. They become an even greater champion for it because they realize it solves a different problem. If you're familiar with DJ Val, who is in Colorado and has become a buddy throughout the years, she started showing up to the Bitcoin meetups in Denver. And if you met DJ Val, she's exuberant, and she's got these wonderful teenage kids and this wonderful family, and she's sort of a hippie, very free, crunchy liberal type by all accounts, and I won't pigeonhole in any sense, but just so you can get the picture. And she shows up to these meetups with all these neck beards, and the first thing I think is, what the hell is this lady doing here? And I pulled her aside at one of the meetups and I said, Val, what are you doing here? Why is this the room that you want to be in, surrounded by all these people? Like, how did you even get into Bitcoin? And she looks at me and she goes, oh, it was the human rights perspective. I go, what? She goes, yeah, Bitcoin is this tool that's being used by all these human rights advocates. I care so much about all these various issues that are happening throughout the world and monetary freedom that people have, and Bitcoin is a tool for them to basically preserve their monetary freedom in unfriendly regimes. Yeah, I love Bitcoin. I'm all about it. And she was probably the exemplar, the first case of me seeing something like this where I was like, oh, dang, it's a stumbling block. It's not a wall, because everyone has a very good reason to like and love Bitcoin.
Yeah, I like that perspective. I share it, obviously. I think it's actually looking at the data. If we had this data last year that showed a slight tilt to the right in Bitcoin ownership relative to the population, that would have been huge news still. Bitcoin's only very slightly tilted to the right, but it almost looks like the regular population. Like, we would have been stunned, and people still wouldn't have believed us. The fact that this is true after Trump coin has been debuted and Melania coin, and we have a crypto dinner with Bitcoiners and crypto people put on by, for the inauguration, that where Melania coin is debuted or whatever. Like, all of this kind of stuff that the left, it's nightmare fuel for the left. The auctioning off time with the president by the largest holders of his coin, his son's involvement, his involvement with the Bitcoin conference. As much as possible, the Trump family has tried to tie their brand to Bitcoin. And David Bailey, I will not speak ill of him, but he has tried to do the same thing from the other side, from the Bitcoin brand side. That's his grand bargain and his grand strategy: help Trump and get help from Trump. Of course, that's going to take a massive toll on the perception of Bitcoin among people who view Trump as a threat to democracy and everything holy. So it's actually really surprising that it only kind of made a dent in that distribution. You know what I mean? Given all that and given where people thought it was. But I think, and I take hope from what you're saying. Of course, as you said, a part of that story, I was in all of those fights with environmentalists and energy experts 3-4 years ago, and along with hundreds and hundreds of people. And some of it was, we won those fights, and some of it was people stopped fighting because it was like painful to go up against the cyber hornets, you know? So some people like never changed their mind, but just sort of withdrew to blue sky or wherever is safe for them. And other people, I think, actually opened up. You know, Daniel, as you mentioned, Daniel Batten has done a really wonderful job of just on every single post, every single story, dumping the most recent 13 peer-reviewed articles that are positive for Bitcoin. I can't believe how much energy that guy has for that.
Immense.
You know, for that single task over and over again. I just get bored and demoralized after a while. But Daniel has stayed at it impressively. But we have something like that ahead of us, and it's not going to get easier in the short term because the Trump brand is so highly polarizing. I don't think it's going to get easier. I don't think we're going to see this trend reverse. But we, at the same time, we have the price exploding, and when we're over $100,000, and this is probably part of the reason why that shape of Bitcoiners looks almost like the distribution of political ideology in America. People like money, and when you have this asset which just keeps performing in opposition to or in defiance of all of the predictions that it would fail, it keeps performing as a network. But it also keeps performing as an asset. You can't ignore that after a while. Mm-hmm. You see critics like Scott Galloway the other day complimenting Saylor and saying he still doesn't have any Bitcoin, but you know that Michael Saylor's a really smart guy. Eventually, people bend the knee. I mean, I think was one of those. BlackRock bent the knee. You know, it's a matter of time before Vanguard does. Mm-hmm. You can't ultimately deny price action, and people on the left are going to be like, well, it is this horrible thing, but it seems to keep going up in value, and maybe I get some and I just don't talk about it. Maybe I don't say anything about it online, but I just get
Trump
some.
Voter.
I think that's it. There's the quiet Bitcoiner. They don't want their public reputation associated with it. There's reputational risk there to talk about it, in part because you might be associated with Trump or crime or impact to the environment. But if you acquire a little bit on a Coinbase account, nobody will ever needs to know that. Well, unless Coinbase leaks your email, but no one should in principle know about it. It's just a part of your investment portfolio. And I think that's what our survey is picking up on. There is a growing, quiet majority of Bitcoin owners who are all over the political spectrum. They're in every demographic. Racially, we found this year, whites own at like half the rate of non-whites. Non-whites own at higher rates.
Is that surprising?
It's not because other surveys have found it. We only found a slight edge to non-whites last year. This year, it was very significant. So yeah, but it's just people are buying Bitcoin, you know, and they want to make money. And their ideology and what they say on Twitter and who they vote for, that's a different thing.
Money talks.
Money talks.
Troy, this has been immense. I can't wait for this research to come out in full published form, and we're really excited to share it and distribute it to all of our friends and you know, viewers and members and whatnot. There's one question I'm curious if we could get your thoughts on as we round this little Bitcoin Park Live out, which is we always have this, and you hit on it tangentially with the mention of Trump and the sort of ancillary coins and the crypto gala ball, whatever they had. Do you have any thoughts about the Bitcoin versus everything world of Bitcoin versus crypto and the interplay there?
Well, I think it's amazing. Our survey shows the benefits to Bitcoin from crypto as well as the downsides, I believe. The benefits to crypto really comes back to that self-custody number, that 11 million. Once I dug into it and realized these crypto apps have hundreds of millions of downloads and they're self-custodying. And then I found some source saying 30% of those crypto wallets have Bitcoin on them. I don't know if that's high, but even if it's a fraction of that, you have 200 million downloads of a single wallet, a trust wallet. Then you have the by far most popular cryptocurrency, which is Bitcoin. I mean, people get those wallets because they can't do things on exchanges like DeFi. Why would you self-custody in a wallet, crypto? Because you want to hold your NFTs there. You want to borrow against your Ethereum and put it in some, I don't know, other scam. So people got those wallets because they were playing casino games in crypto. And then I think as Bitcoin triumphed and Bitcoin dominance rises, people sell their shitcoins for Bitcoin. But they have them in self-custody. Maybe, depending on how they do the exchange, maybe they're wrapped. That's another question we could have asked. Maybe they're wrapped on another chain. And so they're not really Bitcoin, but they're claims on Bitcoin. And I think that's probably 2/3, 3/4 at least of the self-custody. And so that's the gift that crypto has given us, is crypto has given us a bunch of self-custodied Bitcoiners. And then I think the curse that crypto has given us, it shows up in the sentiment numbers, that trust and morality and utility. I think all of the association of those scams with Bitcoin, it pushes those numbers way down. I mean, I'm here at the college, at Reed College. When I walk by my friends, like my poli-sci prof friend, Paul Gronke, will say, "Hey, Troy, how was the meeting yesterday?" And it's because Trump had the meeting with like Trump coin holders. And I'm like, what are you talking about, dude? And he's like, you do that stuff, don't you? Were you at that meeting? And don't you hold Trump coin? I was like, no. I mean, he's partly giving me a hard time, but it's everybody here thinks I work on crypto. All of my colleagues, no matter how many times I say, no, just Bitcoin, not crypto. They're like, okay, Bitcoin, crypto. Okay. They don't get it. And I assume that's representative. So crypto is killing us on the reputational front, on the sentiment front, but it is helping us on the self-custody front. I think it's probably also helping us on Capitol Hill in various ways, because some of our concerns at least are aligned there. The right to self-custody, the right to run a node, the right to make software and not be held legally liable for all users of that software. Those are things we have in common with that community. So I think it's a complex trade-off, and that both sides of the trade-off show up in the report. But I feel like given the flow of capital to Bitcoin, the Bitcoin dominance number is just shocking. I mean, that's what thing that's differed from this cycle, from the previous cycles, is that we haven't seen those Bitcoin winnings get translated into gambling money on all the shitcoins. Instead, they just keep eating their lunch. The Ethereum is just stagnant. So I feel like it's kind of the best combination right now. Best thing you could have hoped for a couple of years ago is that Bitcoin dominance would grow at the same time that the whole crypto market cap is also growing. Yeah. Like you said, there's a journey for Bitcoiners, right? We go through this learning path. I feel like the shitcoin part of the learning path, maybe it's different this time. I feel like in the previous cycle, a lot of people came in to Bitcoin through shitcoins. They didn't start with Bitcoin. They started with some, especially younger people. They never even held Bitcoin. They knew about it, but it's like old fogey coin from them. And they wanted to do these cool new things. And then they kind of washed into Bitcoin because it was eating everything else up as a store of value. And then this time, I don't even know that people are as tempted by it. Instead, they're going for Bitcoin treasury companies. Yeah. It's just a different group, right? It's a different trajectory. And we don't have the same opposition like Bitcoin versus Bitcoin treasury companies, because they're just like buying Bitcoin. So yeah, I think it's very hopeful on that front.
Troy, this has been immense. We can't wait for the report to come out, and hopefully I run the schedule, not hopefully, we'll book a time and we can dive into the responses to all this, because I'm really excited to hear how people jump off from this research and start to build on it, because that's what we need in the space. We need more folks doing this really ground level research that tells us that there's a lot more out there than the internet.
Yeah, that's the great way to put the result from last year and this year again, is if you just look at the internet, you would be misled. If you just look at politics, you'd be wildly misled. If you just looked at mainstream media, you would be wildly misled. Most people don't have a strong opinion about Bitcoin, don't know much about it, sit there in the political middle. Most people who own Bitcoin sit there in the political middle, don't have super strong feelings about politics, and are kind of boring. And that's why they're not yelling at us from some publication or some social media platform.
That's right. Well, let's wind it down there, and I hope you can join us again soon.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it.
And before we go, actually, can you tell us where can people find you, and where should people keep their eyes open for all this incoming research?
I think my Twitter account's probably still the best place to stay on top of things. It's at the Trocro, TheTrocro. And also, yeah, the Nakamoto Project also has a Twitter handle, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you look up the Nakamoto Project, you'll find it.